our brain. So Sarah, did you want to send us off to grab something from our household materials?
Yes, and I have some examples of things that could be used for this activity.
Great.
That we're going to try. Hold on. I just have to grab my bag of activities or of items. Okay, so I'm just looking for people to have something that's a little bit beanbag-like. I've got suggestions, like a fajita sauce pack. Okay, these are items people might have. A Mr. Noodles. Pasta. It's intensely carbs. Lentils for the gluten sensitive. And I've got udon noodles could also be. I don't know. I was looking for things that were beanbag like, because I was looking for, and I was like, who has a beanbag just lying around their house? Some people might have a beanbag. However, if you have an item that's like about this size, that what I want is something that you could like throw in the air and catch. It could, and it would be great if it had a sound that it made when you caught it. I tried it with a sock. You could use a rolled up sock. However, it's not going to be as satisfying. It's got to have a little weight and a little bit of noise.
So grab an
item, one item. If you've got one item, that would be so great. Thank you.
Then we'll reconvene.
I'm at my parents' place. I had to go and raid their pantry, see what they had. Got some black beans.
Looks good. What have you got, Day? Ooh.
You're muted. It's your first time on Zoom. It's okay.
It's okay. Get the hang of it. The package of flaxseed that my midwife recommended I start putting in my food to increase my fiber. As you can see, it's unopened. But eventually I will follow her advice. But I think it's kind of...
Yeah, you got to get there on your own.
Okay, well, let's have a semi-formal start and then we'll roll back into the semi-informal, whatever this turns out to be. So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all. I'm Day Cooper-Hagel. I'm the Director of Mental Health Wilderness First Aid. And I'm delighted to have Sarah here as our second guest speaker, which is a lot of fun. So Sarah and I got acquainted when I was working for the Untitled Tribal Council out on the west coast of Vancouver Island, out in the Tofino Ucluelet area. And Sarah was also a counselor out in that area and kind of somewhat connected between our different organizations. But I'll start by reading Sarah's bio, which is up on the Mental Health Wilderness First Aid website. So Sarah, you can correct me if any of this information's changed. Okay, Sarah is a mother, a certified teacher with the BC Ministry of Education, and a registered clinical counselor with the BC Association of Clinical Counsellors. Originally from Ontario, Sarah came to the West Coast in the early 2000s as a tree planter. I believe you worked for Brinkman, is that right? For about 6 years? Yeah, so veteran tree planter, and later became a teacher where she was honored to work and live in the traditional territories of the Silkwotin, I think I'm saying that right, and Howsett First Nations. After moving to Ucluelet in 2011 and working as a youth and education worker for the Ucluelet First Nation, Sarah decided to pursue a Master's of Education in school-based counseling and has been working in the field since. Sarah has worked for the Untitled Tribal Council, just like myself, as a child and youth mental health counselor for School District 70 as an elementary secondary school counselor, and she currently works under contract for the Coastal Family Resource Coalition in Vancouver Island's Children's Health Foundation, coordinated project aimed at supporting school staff, parents, and caregivers to improve mental health outcomes for children through understanding attachment and neuroscience best practices for developing brains. Sarah believes that nature is the best therapist. I know this is making you sound really great, Sarah. I love it. And she has training in ecotherapy, wilderness rites of passage, holistic expressive play, focusing-oriented psychotherapy, suicide intervention, working with those who have harmed others and being harmed through sexual abuse and assault. And she is currently working towards certification in the Neurosequential model of therapeutics, which I'm really interested in. I was introduced to through Sarah. I haven't done much of the training myself, but it's really fascinating stuff. And I'm sure Sarah will touch on it at some point. She is passionate about meeting people where they are at and providing trauma-informed care. When not working, Sarah enjoys gardening, making art, yoga, surfing, swimming, hiking, and simply being in nature with her 3 wonderful children and supportive spouse. So I really appreciated the work and the interactions that I've had with Sarah. I've found her to be really influential in my development as a clinical counselor, specifically one who's working with young children in the elementary school, which is kind of where we had a lot of our contact. And so her lens on looking at children through a trauma-informed lens and looking at which parts of their brain are activating and deactivating based on their trauma histories and what they're being exposed to in the moment, and then how to not only recognize that, but how to support them developmentally based on how their brain is activating. That's part of what's really inspired me about Sarah's work. And it's also just delightful to spend time with her on the beach and outdoors and as a friend. So really glad to have you here tonight, Sarah. Is there anything you want to add about yourself right now before we see who else is in the room?
That's a lot about me. That's great. Thanks a lot.
That's plenty.
Yeah, that's enough.
Okay.
Great. All right. So I'm really excited to know that one of our participants is walking during this session as well, because one of the things that I'm going to be talking about a lot is about learning and regulation, and how good like a rhythmic activity can help you to learn. So you might be someone who used to rock in school and be told to sit still, or you might have been tapping your pencil. You're just priming yourself. You're just priming your brain for the learning experience. And so that's fine. If you want to move in a way that feels good to you during this session, please feel comfortable to bebop and bounce around. I'm going to do my best not to move too much. I noticed I actually did get a new webcam that wasn't plugged in. So that's why I look probably a little bit more clear. But yeah. So if you've got your item, I'm just going to I wanted to do a little activity to start us off tonight that is borrowed from a group called Balaviz X, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And they're an organization who does work helping people regulate their brains through rhythmic activity. And this is one of their things that they do. They've got their website, and the research and everything is really, really fascinating. I recommend checking it out sometime. But what we're going to do right now is a relational rhythmic experience. So what we're going to do is you're going to throw whatever you've got, if you can, in the air from one hand to the next. Wow. I didn't practice this, but we're just going to practice that. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. And actually, I'm going to ask you guys to unmute if you can for this. And we're going to see if on Zoom that we can sync up. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and we're going to throw it. We're going to see if we can throw our bag of whatever to the other hand in sync. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And we'll see if we can sync it up. Okay. Okay, I'm going to add something now. And we're going to do this now. We're going to go 1, 2, and then you're just going to pass it to the other hand. Okay. And now that we've kind of mastered this skill of passing it, we're going to try and see if we can get in sync again. Noticing we feel in our bodies when we try to sync up. So I'm going to count us in again. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I'll try to do it more rhythmically so you can sync up to me. The camera's not sure what it wants to concentrate on. Anyways, and this activity can get more complex. We could even try throwing it and then passing it behind our backs and throwing it. It's getting a little more stressful. Now I'm like syncing to Rachel, who's kind of syncing to me. Let's see if we can do one. I'm going to keep trying to go at the same speed and see if you guys can sync up to me. What did you do last night? I went on Zoom and threw around some lentils. Oh yeah, me too. All right. Awesome, guys. Thanks. I actually worked up a sweat doing that. I think it's because the wood stove's on downstairs. So I'm going to tell you right now that I'm in 1,000 square feet. And my supportive spouse and 3 lovely children are downstairs. And hopefully they're going to do their best to let us have a peaceful session. I'm in my headphones to try to get rid of some of the, I'm just moving my chair. I just got this comfortable chair here. And I'm in like the, you know, the Zoom era where you have like one corner of your house that's kind of like set up for your Zooming. The rest of it's crazy. Okay. All right. So already you know that I was a tree planter. I guess I kind of want to start off tonight. So what I'm going to talk about right now to start off with is kind of a little bit of what some of my influences are, especially for those of you who are interested in going into, and I am going to talk about what we just did with the lentils, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit later as it pertains to lifestyle as therapy. All right. So just noticing how we feel in our body, had that nice experience together, and just settling in. And if you have, I have notes that I'm going to be kind of looking at to help me organize my brain. If you have questions as we go along, I'm okay with taking questions. If you want me to repeat something, or if you have a question as we go along, I'm okay with repeating it. Okay. I'm also happy to provide credit or links to any of this. This is one thing I'm trying to be very aware of, is crediting the people, the wonderful people who have influenced me and who I've had the opportunity to learn from. I'd say not much of this material is original. However, it resonates with me, and I feel it's important for me to share it with you. And I also think it's important for me to acknowledge that I'm thrilled and very grateful to be joining you today from Youth Luatha traditional territory. And I love living and working here. So I'm a nature lover. I was born in the bush. I was born in Bancroft, Ontario at the hospital, but I lived in a little place in the Ottawa Valley in Ontario called Maynooth. It was a very nature place. My dad always talks about a very natural place. My dad talks about me being a baby covered in black flies, and great, super. Sarah's just turning her video off so she can eat dinner. Another great thing to do while you're learning. Eat it up. All right. So I grew up I was a baby covered in black flies. My dad always laughed because I was always my happiest in nature throughout my entire life. He thought it was funny that I had ended up moving to the city, going to university, doing all kinds of urban things, being really involved in theater. But in the end, I just wanted to be a tree planter and travel around and live in the bush with my friends. And I found that for me at the time in my life that I went to tree planting, it was my rite of passage. So like Dave mentioned, I'm really interested in wilderness rites of passage and the way that nature tends to hold space for us in order to have our own growth and find meaning in life. And because we don't have structured rites of passage everywhere um, in our society, I'd say, like some people have cultural rites of passage that they might have in their family, but I think collectively our rites of passage have become like getting a driver's license, going to the bar for the first time, getting to vote, right? But I feel that our souls desire something more, and I feel that nature provides that space for something more. But today I'm not talking about rites of passage. That's a whole other session. In I guess it was in 2011, yeah, 10 years ago, my children experienced a trauma in nature that for me really fractured my relationship with nature. And I had to do a lot of healing after that. And actually, that's where I became involved in wilderness rites of passage and where I went out and did some healing on the land there. I didn't really understand trauma at that time. I didn't really know what it was. I knew that I had experienced it and that I had it and my kids needed help and I needed help, but I didn't know very much about it until I went to teachers college, and I was in a course where we were learning about disorders, all kinds of disorders, um, mental health disorders. And one of our presenters talked about trauma and talked about how sometimes the responses that we have in our nervous system and in our brain to trauma can sometimes look like disorders, mental health disorders. The way that we can become tuned up through trauma can actually produce symptoms that can make a child or an adult even look like they have maybe something called ADHD or something called anxiety. And that's about the symptoms of those disorders, because disorders are a collection of symptoms that we decide mean that we have something, right? So we collect the symptoms together. We like, oh, all those symptoms together, that's anxiety or whatever, right? However, they can be produced through different experiences that we have. And that's where I'm going to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of trauma. So for me, that was a major aha. I was like, oh, I know this. I know this. And so I went on in my learning and in my journey, and I became interested in the things I thought I needed to know about, because I really first became a counselor because I thought I wanted to help my family, and I found the mental health system was a really challenging system in which to try to find help for our kids. Sorry, I'm seeing two chats and I just want to make sure that I'm not missing a question or something, but it's just a comment. Okay. Anyways, sorry. So I started learning as much as I could about trauma-informed care. I became really passionate about it. So I've been presenting for the last 6 years in the schools here about trauma-informed care and understanding like what children who have experienced trauma need, because as a teacher, I saw a lot of learning challenges that were the result of a nervous system and a brain that had been impacted by trauma. And what I believed at that time was what I was seeing. And I became it just became what I wanted to learn about. And I ended up bringing me to one of my mentors, Marie Jose Dais. She's located in Parksville. She's an expressive play therapist. And her idea of humanity and how people develop was the idea that we all come from a seed, a golden seed being that is very sacred, and that each of us is like a seed from a different plant. Like we're not all the same seed, but that we all have the capacity and the desire to go towards the light, to grow towards the light. And if we're given the right conditions, that we will, in fact, do that. And she has some ideas about what the conditions are for healing. And I'm not going to go too far into those. However, something that really resonated with me when she talked was she talked a lot about nature as the perfect milieu for healing, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later as well. But she had this idea that we're all like from this germ that has this desire to go through towards the light, and that we're really wise inside. And that also goes with there's trauma-informed practice, which is about understanding that people have trauma. It affects them in certain ways, and there are ways that we can work with them in order to help them with their trauma. And Marie Jose's idea of that we have this like innate healing inside of us is also resonant with a theory that I'm going to talk about a little bit more too, called healing centered engagement, which is about having a lifestyle, creating a lifestyle that actually is healing for us and helping support other people towards what is right in them, what they know, what their innate wisdom is to heal. So I'm going to start talking about, so those are some of the things. And then my other mentor is Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a psychiatrist and with a deep interest in neuroscience, who's worked with all kinds of, if you ever have he just wrote a book with Oprah. He's all over the place right now. You can watch all kinds of talks of his on YouTube, and he's very accessible. And he's just like, there you go. Look, it's everywhere. It's even in Day's room. Yeah. And Bruce Perry, he is like, when you go to see, I saw him speak in Courtney once, and he was just so approachable and easygoing. And he wasn't a guy who was showing up with all kinds of books. He said, if you want my book, you could buy it at a store. I didn't bring a whole bunch. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to teach people. And he's been very generous with his theory, his method of healing, which is the neurosequential. He began with the neurosequential method of therapeutics, which is really just a way of understanding humans. It's not a modality of healing, but it's a way of understanding humans, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a second. And his idea is that we're not taught resilience, but we have experiences that make us resilient. So resilience is experienced. It's not necessarily taught, or it's not necessarily, yeah. So I think that's a really hopeful message too. And I like the neuroscience perspective too, not only because it helps us to understand our body really holistically, because that's our brain that governs our entire body. And so it's our mind is our body, and our body is our mind. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about too. Yeah, am I rambling, or am I tracking this thing? Giving you a bit of a history of the background. Okay. So basically, the neurobiology of trauma, our brain is the only organ in our body that is use dependent, which means our brain is shaped by the experiences that we have. All right. From the time that we're born. So if in utero, we're born to someone with a really high heart rate, because they're experiencing possibly themselves intense stress, which increases the heart rate, which we talk about in mental health wilderness first aid. Okay. When we are born, we will have a higher resting heart rate because we're tuned up to the person that we were born into. And our brainstem is the first part of our brain that is developed. Okay. And it governs. That's our lizard brain. When Day talks about it, I'll show you the lizard and the wizard after. She gave me the picture. I was looking for other visuals, but a lot of the visuals and a lot of the clips are just other people talking about the same things that I'm going to kind of talk about. So our brain is use dependent. It's shaped by our experiences, and our brain develops from the bottom up. So our brainstem is developed first from the bottom up and from the inside out. So your brainstem develops first, and then the next part of your brain, the other parts of your brain develop from there. So that's why it's called neurosequential model of therapeutics. Neuro, the brain, sequential, our brain develops sequentially, building on top of each other. Bruce Perry has a heuristic model, which I'd love to show you, but I'm not fully certified yet. And so I'm not going to, I can't use the materials until I get the stamp, because fidelity is really important in this theory, and people can misuse those if they don't fully understand. However, so in Bruce Perry's model, he breaks the brain down to simplify things into 4 basic systems. Okay. And they develop sequentially on top of each other. So when we talk about the lizard brain, we're talking about the brain stem, which and I've got a whole bunch of like different sheets around here. So you're going to see me looking around the room like, what am I looking at? I'm looking at my cheat sheets. Okay. So the brainstem governs like our heart rate, our blood pressure, our breathing, our body temperature, and our metabolism. Okay. Comes back up to our the next part of the brain, which is reflexive and reactive. So the lizard brain is kind of these two bottom parts. Okay. So our brainstem and what Bruce Perry refers to as the diencephalon. And that takes care of our motor regulation, our state regulation, our circadian rhythms. So the sleep rhythms, our reflexive behaviors, our appetite and our satiety, and our arousal regulation. So, when we become activated, so to speak. Okay. On top of, so these are the parts of your brain. So when you think about it too, in terms of little kids, one of my cheat sheets. So when you think about it in terms of like a baby, right? This brain, your brain's not fully developed until you're 25. You don't have your, cortex properly developed. So the next part of your brain up is the limbic system, which is governs more of your emotive, you're sensitive, driven by pleasure. This is your reward system, kind of your attachment system. Okay. So, but they build on top of each other. So if during your development there are insults that to certain, it can change how you function. So when I mentioned that you could have a higher resting heart rate, which would affect you when you're smaller, because it's harder to regulate when you have a higher resting heart rate, right? It's like people say, oh, they went from 0 to 60 when someone's getting upset and they kind of flip out. But that person might rest at like 40, right? So they don't go from 0 to 60, they go from 40 to 60, which is a shorter place from being activated to not being activated. Those babies are harder to settle that have a higher resting heart rate. When you work with children who experience trauma, sometimes you can know that they are more activated because you know that they have a higher resting heart rate than other kids, or you can tell that people are activated when they have I have a cat that's getting trapped in a plastic bag. Okay. I don't want to go too far into this stuff because it sounds really confusing and it's lots of big words, but it doesn't need to be that confusing. But basically what I'm saying is what happens is if you have early childhood trauma, it changes how you regulate going up into your higher regions of your brain. So that's my interest in it, right? Because I'm working with children but what's really cool about it is that the brain develops sequentially. And if we do interventions that are sequential as well, we could rebuild those lower parts of the brain and spend more time in the cortex, which is the part of our brain that makes us human, right? Doesn't Homo sapiens mean like knowing about knowing or something like that? I read that somewhere once, something like that. Okay, so because we have this different kind of consciousness, which makes us different than other creatures. Okay, and
Sarah, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Just you're talking, it's so fascinating to me because we've started talking in the mental health wellness first aid course just briefly, but about how you're talking about the limbic system, that central kind of part of the brain, how it attunes to rhythm, and how, it's the part of the brain that's developing when we're inside mom. And so it attunes to mom's heartbeat, like you're saying. And so for, if mom is regulated and has a regulated heartbeat and isn't experiencing a lot of stress or trauma themselves, then the baby will attune to a heartbeat about 60 to 80 beats per minute. But then we were talking about this in terms of traditional teachings too, is that if mom is dysregulated and has a high heart rate, then that baby's limbic system will attune to a higher heart rate. And so one thing we were talking about, which I wonder if you can comment on, is that for those babies, sometimes as they grow up, if that like early developmental trauma is not addressed, that they might be attuned to that higher heart rate. And so for them, relaxing and lowering the heart rate to what would be more average can actually feel unsafe. Like if you try to relax a kid that has been highly traumatized, some kids that works and some kids that actually like activates them more because they actually don't feel safe at a lower resting heart rate. Have you heard of that? We were just talking about that in a different context.
Well, the thing about it is like, that I think they do regulate at like people will, if you notice people who tap or rock, I mentioned earlier, they will tap or rock at what their mother's resting heart rate was. So if someone has a higher rest, they'll rock a little bit faster, right? So they'll find that kind of a rhythm a little bit more regulating. I think I can't really answer your question exactly, quite honestly. I know that sometimes people will find a lower resting heart rate. Yeah, I can't really answer your question. I'm thinking about something that I really don't want to throw in the bag of
That's fair enough. Maybe
that's
I'm getting
off in
too
a
off
different
topic.
direction. But I'm going to learn more about that and answer that question. But
Yeah.
some people do find meditation and quiet space and some of those things really dysregulating. But it's also knowing yourself, right? And knowing your own conditions as well. And I think that I do think that reducing your heart rate is mostly a positive intervention for people when they're becoming dysregulated.
Thanks. I don't want to dysregulate
That's
your
okay.
talk either.
That's all right. I'm like,
No,
now
but I
I'm really
appreciate
thinking
it.
about that. And that's something that I of course, I'm not finished my training at this point.
Yeah.
And yeah. So, and what I was going to talk about too is like, so our brain is shaped by our experiences, and stress is one of the factors that can change our functioning. And so that's trauma basically is stress, is like an intensely stressful experience. And mild, like less intense, regular, predictable stress actually builds our resilience and actually builds our brain. So positive stress is good. So that's activities that are mildly stressful. For example, we need a little bit of stress to learn. We can't be completely relaxed in order for us to learn. We have to be a little bit interested. Okay? So we're like mildly stressed. You don't know what I'm going to say next. So you're kind of wondering what I'm going to say next. And I might even be a little bit confusing. We're doing my best. Okay. I'm not going to digress. I've talked to Dave about this before. Okay. So this cat is behind me. It was crawling up my back just a second ago. So regular, predictable stress creates a resilient system. Okay, we have a little bit of stress and we come down again. If we've experienced a lot of unpredictable stress, it kind of tunes us up and can make our nervous system feel dysregulated. And some of the activities that you might enjoy often have an element, adventure activities have an element of kind of predictable stress. I'm always kind of nervous when I'm going to go surfing. It's going to be cold. So my 8-year-old says, sometimes I like surfing. Sometimes it's just cold and scary. And I agree with him. But even before I put my wetsuit on, I have this nervousness, but it kind of makes me excited. It makes me interested and it keeps my learning curve going. When I get out there and the waves aren't what I expected, or it becomes too stressful, I have to check out. It can be a relaxing experience or not a relaxing experience, but what keeps me coming back to it is there is a little bit of predictable stress that keeps it interesting, as well as some of the other things that are going on. So prolonged chaotic stress is basically what creates something called complex trauma, which is where we would have symptoms that might look like disorders. That's what I was referring to earlier. A single event trauma might create triggers to certain events, certain sights and smells, because what your brain is constantly doing is when something really scary happens, your brain collects up as much information about what's going on during that stressful event and consolidates it because your brain is awesome and it wants you to survive next time something like that happens. So triggers come from some of those evocative cues that are happening when something really stressful happens, because if your brain picks up on any of those happening again, it's going to save you. That's why someone who may have experienced a traumatic fire smells toast burning and can go into a panic attack, right? Because the smell of the smoke, the experience of it might create an evocative cue initially, or sirens, or things that you aren't even aware of sometimes. So understanding that sometimes that can happen, but that actually our heart rate can be changed and our neurosequencing can be changed when we have prolonged unpredictable stress. And it creates a difficulty with us. Everybody has something called a window of tolerance for stress. Okay. And that's like that positive, predictable stress stays within the window of tolerance. And then if we have lots of unpredictable, chaotic stress, then we come out of our window of tolerance. Look at me looking on my area here. Yeah. So you can carry on with your daily life. And I'm not going to go too much on because I'm looking at the time. Okay. So Bruce Perry talks about what are the conditions for implementing a therapeutic intervention. Like, what is it the brain likes? What is it that shapes the brain? So I've said unpredictable stress. Okay. But what is it that actually helps our brain to heal? So I want to talk about the neurobiology of trauma a little bit for you, but what I really want to talk about is more, what are the conditions for healing after experiences that have been traumatic, and maybe experiences that have been, you know, yeah. So what Bruce Perry says is that intervention should be, first of all, relational. So what we were doing when we first started off at the beginning of throwing our beans around, we're like looking at each other, we're tuning into each other, and we're laughing because who knew you were coming out to throw beans around tonight? Okay. It was rhythmic, which means it's got a rhythmic nature. I was kind of trying to throw my beans around rhythmically. Ideally, who knows? I'm not the greatest rhythmic person. I'm working on it. It's repetitive, so you have more than one chance. It was a little bit hard when I kept changing the activity, but I was trying to keep it a little bit interesting for you because I don't know how much you throw beans around. The one rhythm might have been not enough for you. Okay. It's rewarding. I don't know how rewarding that was, but it was kind of fun. Got a little dopamine, had a laugh. Okay. And it's respectful. I didn't ask you to do anything that was really uncomfortable. And I respected the fact that you might not have a beanbag. I asked you to bring what you had already, and what you had was just good enough, whether it was lentils or flax seeds or whatever it was that you brought. So those are the conditions for creating a kind of a healing intervention. And what's really interesting and what I really love about Bruce Perry's work is that Bruce Perry really talks about it being about the practices in your life. So therapy at 45, you're not going to change your brain in 45 minutes to an hour a week. It's what you do in between the times that you're doing therapy that is what's important. And what I like about the neurosequential method of therapeutics, and what I was saying, is it's not a healing modality. So I use a lot of different modalities with people that work with different parts of the brain. I don't do people. Am I going to like clinical to talk about cognitive behavior therapy day, or is it okay? Because you talk about your lizard brain and your wizard brain interventions. So if I'm working with somebody who's pretty dysregulated, who's having sleep issues, who's having stomach issues, I'm not going to go into talking to them about changing the way that they think about sleep and eating in their cortex. I'm going to try to work with them to regulate themselves in their brainstem and in that lower part of their brain, and do activities that work and develop those lower parts of the brain before we can get to talking about going to the cortical elements. And until they're like feeding, and of course you think about like something like the hierarchy of needs, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you've thought about that, right? Like you got to have your food, your water, your lights and stuff like that before you can go thinking about like enlightenment, getting into those other areas of the brain. So now I'm going to talk about thinking about all the things I've already talked about. Is this okay? Am I still on track, Day?
This is awesome, Sarah. I'm taking so many notes, partly because I'm sure we'll come back and talk about this later, but you talked about, interventions should be relational, rhythmic, repetitive, and rewarding. And I'm just thinking about like how many of our outdoor activities hit how many of those different points. And I'm sure you're going to get there, so I don't want to jump ahead of you, but
Well, that's what it
so
is.
cool what you're talking about.
Well, that's, yeah. And so that's what we're talking about. So that's like my passion of working with teachers and working with systems that work with traumatized children on a daily basis. I want to fill those people with as much information as I can. I went and became a counselor because I was a child and youth care worker. I loved what I was seeing with the kids in my program. I loved being their everyday person. I loved being there with them. But when they came and talked to me about the challenges of their life because of the relationship we had, I felt like I needed more skills. I discovered, though, after being that child and youth care worker and becoming their therapist and coming once a week to do 45 minutes to an hour, that I actually had a much greater impact on their wellness and the goodness in their life by creating the positive memories and the experiences that we had every single day. I was there when everybody came off the bus. We had food, we had a talking circle, we had all different things going on different days of the week based on their interests. We had cooking classes, homework clubs, swimming lessons, all the things that we were doing. And we did them all because of the budget that we had. You know, we did them all together. And they were mostly homemade. We did hire a swimming lessons teacher so that they could get like their certifications or whatever, but it was mostly just like us, me and these like 12 kids going swimming, me and these 12 kids going to the bowling alley. We'd take the bus out on the weekend or whatever, right? So being able to do those things, actually your healing happens in your day-to-day life and the practices. That's what I love about working when I worked with in the position that Day and I shared with the New Toronto Tribal Council. There's lots of talk about healing practices. You don't just do something that's healing once and then be like, oh, I'm not healed yet. It's a practice. You do it every day. And that's because it's resonant with your brain. We've had trauma for thousands and thousands of centuries, but we've never had so many challenges with our mental health. I think partly because we've become disconnected from, we made it too complicated. And so that's my real interest. I'd like to work myself out of the job, and I'd like to demystify mental health for people and make it about what you do in your everyday life. You can be your own healer. I know, and that's like a scary thing to say in the mental health world, right? Because like, what if all these people go out and become their own healers? Sounds like a great world. But we have to do it together because it's relational, right? We're still going to need people in our lives who we can do some of these things with. So a lot of the healing practices that I have in my life, I do them with companionship. I go for a walk with my friend to the beach and we talk about things and we stand in the water together and we go surfing together and we do the things that are regulating in a relational way. So, and nature to me is the ultimate healing milieu, because when we think about the idea that we want to have an experience that's rhythmic and repetitive, look at the rhythm of nature. Every single day, the tide comes in and the tide goes out. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. It helps us to regulate our circadian rhythms. My body is in rhythm with when I wake up and I want to break fast. I'm ready to have my food. It's helping me with the part of my brain that's, I have a routine that is rhythmic with my breakfast, my lunch, and my dinner. If I do those things in relationship with other people, even better. You think about what the outcomes are for mental health and youth. They say if they eat one meal a day with their family. There are all these like positive outcomes for kids who eat one meal a day with family, right? With another person that they care about. So, and it gives you a rhythm. And that's part of the reason that it gives you a rhythm. And the cycles of nature, the seasons that we go through, the cycles that we see of life and death and regeneration. Sarah said she wanted to talk about compost. I'm like, that sounds healing. That's a therapeutic metaphor. You know, what we had that was great, that we used, that we put it back and we make something new out of it and we grow something else. What is more hopeful than a seed? What is more helpful than a garden? You know, I think about that as a therapeutic intervention. So And there's all the other things that are regulating the way that a brisk wind can make us suddenly inhale, almost like an infant when you blow in their face and they go. I find that sometimes when I'm outside and suddenly a wind comes out of nowhere, I'm awakened by it. I'm soothed by it. And what else does nature do? Predictable stress really well. Oh, I'm going to get cold now, but I'm going to be okay. It can be overwhelming in situations that, when we're too cold, and, we talk about those in mental health wilderness first aid too, right? It can be really dysregulating. But also if it's a predictable stress and now I'm going to feel cold and I've got a jacket in my bag and I'm prepared for it, right? And that's also part of the intervention too, is being prepared. That's part of the reason in the mental health wilderness first aid, we also talk about like safety first, right? Because we have a plan for safety, and that's part of regulating ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and we also talk, like you're talking about, encountering predictable amounts of stress voluntarily. We talk about that with the baby step ladder intervention, right? And that's so meaningful for people to not necessarily just avoid the things that give them anxiety or stress, but to voluntarily encounter them in appropriately kind of portioned amounts. Like you're talking about that window of tolerance.
Yeah, and you can expand, and
so
mindfully
cool.
doing that allows you to expand your will. You can expand your window of tolerance. So that was a pro day I gave a couple of years ago, which was all about teachers and expanding their window of tolerance by using mindfulness in times that they're not.
That's great. I love to, Dave, don't you talk about in the course sometimes the word eustress with that you at the beginning? It's such a different lens than what we have culturally to put on stress, and to view it as a tool in the appropriate places.
Yeah, like the difference between distress and eustress. And eustress is actually really positive, like Sarah's talking about. Yeah. And I just keep thinking about all these, maybe we'll talk about this later. I don't want to get ahead of you, Sarah, but there's, you talk about like relational, rhythmic, repetitive, and rewarding things, and encountering predictable stresses in voluntary ways. And I'm just thinking about like being part of something like a tree planting community, or being part of something like an outdoor education community, where all of these things are happening. You're eating together, you're doing relational things where you're encountering, challenges appropriately spaced, voluntarily, and repeating things over and over. Like there's just attuning to the rhythms of nature. There's so many things you're talking about that I'm like, I wonder if we could be more intentional about just recognizing how what we're doing can be therapeutic, and just like adding bits to a planting camp or something like that to support that.
Yeah, and that's what my passion is in working with systems, right? Is the idea that once we realize, so one of the things that's really cool is when I think about my mentor Marie-Josée and her belief that we all have an innate wisdom. So many of these things we already do. But when we learn that they are helpful to us, we acknowledge that we're already doing them, we realize that we can do them intentionally. And once you do something intentionally, it has a lot more power. Oh, I'm going to do this now, and I'm going to do this way because of this. And I loved when Michael McCarthy was here last time. I did have a chance to listen to his talk, and he talks about the natural rhythms of the moon. If you go back and listen to Michael's talk, if you haven't had a chance to yet, because a lot of what Michael's talking about is what Bruce Perry has turned into this theory of understanding humans through neuroscience. And it just gives, and it's not to take away from what's already said, because I think what's powerful is what is powerful is already there, right? I don't want to suggest that things need to be validated through science. But what's interesting to me as someone who works in a therapeutic context is understanding that what people are already doing in their day-to-day lives is therapeutic. And giving this lens to it allows me to say to people, well, I told this person, to go for, like, it's a prescription to go for a walk every morning. It's a prescription to eat breakfast at this around the same-ish time to create a day of rhythm so that you can create a predictability to your day. And when you think about being on trip, I mean, I think that part of the reason for me that tree planting was so helpful, it had a real rhythm to every day. We got up at a certain time, you made your lunch, you were with your friends, you got in the truck, you went out, and there was a predictable amount of stress. I could predict that like trees might not come. And it helped to build resilience because you had to problem solve in the bush. And I think the same is true of out trips and paddling trips as well, right? Certain things could go wrong. You're prepared for most of them, but you're going to have this predictable level of stress. So what I wanted us to do now is I kind of wanted us to think about, and the other thing that you had mentioned too was, like the rhythm too of the activities, the actual activities that you're doing. Like if you think about walking, right? It's one of the best interventions. Most of the therapy I do now that's outside involves going for some kind of a walk. So we go for a walk somewhere in nature. I love that, Terry, that you're a trail builder and you're interested in this stuff because you make these nature places accessible for people. And walking is such a great activity because you're walking beside each other. It's not confrontational. You're parallel. Right? You're having a parallel experience. You're talking to each other. You're both doing the same thing and you're getting in sync. When you're walking beside someone, you end up walking in time, in step, without even realizing. You attune to one another. And you feel good. It's very regulating because of that rhythmic. But what I wanted us to do is think about doing your favorite activity in nature. And I want you to think about a place that you like. And I'd like you to just take a moment, and I'm going to ask people to unmic. I'm going to be done kind of the didactic piece of my conversation, I think, in like 15 minutes or so, and then we can be more open floor for questions. But what I wanted to say is I want you to imagine yourself doing the activity that you find regulating and that you enjoy in a favorite place in nature. And I just kind of want to do a little bit of people can throw it out there like popcorn kind of share about what are you seeing in that space? What are you actually physically seeing when you're thinking about the activity that you find the most regulating in nature? Like if I was talking about what I'm seeing water lapping. Terry?
Oh, it's more than just seeing most of the time. It's the sounds, the feel of the sun, the little wind, the little smells of the pine, or you get a little whiff of that sweetness of a poplar, or you hear someone chatting in the background, or I spend a lot of time in the backcountry, so.
So it's a full somatosensory experience. I love when Bruce Perry talks about we start off our life in the womb, he calls it a somatosensory bath.
Yes. Yeah.
And I like that idea. I feel like that in nature, and I'm having a somatosensory bath.
Yeah. I find it easier to hold space for others too. When you're in the backcountry, or when you're in a trail or something, it seems like something flows better than sitting in an office.
I fully agree. So and that's in part because you find nature so regulating as well.
Yes.
And so when we're regulated ourselves, it's so much easier to hold space for other people when we're in those places experiencing that. And that's my next question was like, what are you seeing, hearing, feeling? Right? And what are you doing? Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I love that word somatosensory. I don't think I've even been introduced to it before, but I like it. I was just thinking of bringing kids down to the water to talk sometimes and just throwing rocks in the water with them, and that being also a regulating, rhythmic, repetitive, relational activity. And I hadn't even thought about it in that way before, but I've always kind of done things like that to help connect, because sometimes, like Terry's saying, like sitting in an office is not it just doesn't hit all the same places when you're trying to work with kids, right? Or adults, to be honest.
Yeah. My latest thing is looking for mushrooms. If you have something that you can focus on, that is, because mushrooms are so funny. You will look and look and not find anything. And then you calm yourself and you focus on what's in front of you. You'll see one and then you'll start seeing a whole bunch. And then it regulates your body down into a nice state where you're focused and really nothing else matters for a specific period in time.
Kind of that flow. Sometimes people talk about that flow state
Oh,
when
yes.
you're in that place.
Yes, that's a common thing lately. So,
And so you talked about what you're seeing, hearing, and feeling, and you talked a little bit about what you're experiencing in your body, right? And that state of being regulated, that felt experience that you're having. And so the repetition of that very regulated feeling, you're with somebody, it's very therapeutic because like I said before, your brain is use dependent.
yes.
It's shaped by the experiences that you have.
Yeah.
And so many repetitions, like I say sometimes to my clients, when you have many good moments, you have a good day. And when you have many good days, you have a good life. And that's the idea. That's why people are coming.
Sarah, is the kind of theory or idea behind this that if we've experienced trauma or we're stressed, just what degree of that it is, then those lower parts of our brain, like you're saying, are dysregulated. So doing something that's relational, repetitive, rhythmic, whatever the other one was, that helps to calm those lower areas of the brain, and that allows the cortex, like the wizard brain, to function. Is that, am I summarizing
Yeah.
approximately what you're saying?
Everything that we experience has to pass through all those places, right?
Right.
So when we have an experience that activates us to have like too much stress, right? Like starts to activate those part of our brain, they get noisy and we can't get there. So part of my interest in working with teachers is not to teach them, not to talk to them and have them learn everything that I know as a therapist, but have them to understand how the brain functions and to create. So I knew that before we were going to have this learning experience that I was going to download a whole bunch of information to you. So part of the reason we threw around the beans, right, was we were priming the pump a little bit here. We were working on it. I mean, it was a little bit mystical. Okay, because you weren't really sure what I was doing, which could be a little bit too much stress, but too much novelty, too much new might be too stressful. But I'm guessing that at this point, like if this was your first ever Zoom meeting, that might have been really weird. Maybe it might have been like too much novelty. She's starting around beans. We're on the computer. This is too weird. Yes. So thinking about that, nature as a healing milieu, we've talked a little bit about how nature, how lifestyles are therapy. And so that's my interest was I went from people are talking about trauma informed care all the time. And a few years ago, I read this article by this guy named Sean, and I don't know if it's Ginwright or Ginwright, but he talks about the idea of healing centered engagement. And it's a move from that idea of like trauma informed practice brings us from that disordered view of what's wrong with you. What's wrong with you? To what happened to you? What shaped your brain and your humanity like this? What I love about the neurosequential method too is when they talk about humans and how they're behaving, they don't talk about behavior, they talk about functioning. How are you functioning today? Because what people are doing when people are like pulling their hair out, having different kinds of behaviors, right? It's actually how they're functioning because of what's happened to them and how their brain is tuned and how it is that they're finding to regulate themselves. Okay. And so trauma informed care is kind of about what happened to you. What I really love that Sean Ginwright suggests is or Ginwright, I'm not sure. Sorry, Sean, if you listen to me, that would be crazy because you're amazing. It's what's right with you. And it creates us more into agents in the creation of our own well-being. And I find that really exciting because it's not like people are victims of trauma and you've had this thing happen to you that makes you function in this way. But it also is about empowering people and creating systems and creating a world in which what we know about how people heal and regulate themselves becomes part of the practice and the systems that we build. That we're actually intentionally doing things that we know are healing for people. Kind of a social justice piece there that I like too. And it talks a little bit about, and I think it's really important, especially in this time that we've been in, where we've had a major collective trauma, really, that has had all kinds of offshoot traumas as well. And we've experienced this thing. It kind of brings us back to our collectivism too, right? That we have experienced this thing together. There's not a one size fits all approach to mental health, but there are things that we know can help us create conditions for healing. And many of us are innately wise and are finding them. Even the things that we might refer to as maladaptive coping with difficult situations are pointing us in a direction of what it is that we are looking for, or what we want to be more healing. And what activities can we find that might support us? Support us to have more of that. We live in a culture where maybe alcohol use has a lot to do with freeing ourselves and dancing and going and being with people and socializing, right? But how do we, maybe if it's not working for us, if it's not helping us in our lives and it's creating challenges for us and it doesn't make us feel well and it isn't bringing us into real true connection with others, what are we actually like, what is right in the situation that we're looking for? More relationship, right? We're looking for rewarding experiences and connection with people, and we're finding challenges with that. So Bruce Perry has did a whole series of COVID talks at the beginning of COVID-19, where he explains his whole theory and has like talks and talks and talks and talks about all of this kind of way of thinking about things that I found very, very helpful. And he talked about, when we were first in the lockdowns, people were just kind of doing a lot of self-soothing, watching lots of Netflix, never getting dressed, and how we could actually create a more predictable level of stress by creating routines and structure for ourselves. So when things get more chaotic in your life, you create a little bit more structure in order to regulate yourself, in order to feel better. And some of what happened was, and that's how we could help ourselves to build resilience during that, right? Like too much media, the comfort eating, minimal exercise, like all of those things contributed to a decline in mental health, right? Whereas creating a little bit of structure during lockdown times could actually help us to create a resilience creating level of stress, right? I mean, yeah, could help us to do that because, yeah, I don't know. I was watching the news. I was getting pretty dysregulated. So what we were doing with this lentil throwing around at the beginning was basically, yeah, I think I've explained it. I explained it, the lentils.
We talk about now, I think this was part of the course when you were part of it in the spring, Sarah was talking about trauma and encountering trauma in the field and just strategies for if and when traumatic exposure comes up in the field. What are some strategies that we can use to build people's resilience and help insulate them from the probability of PTSD developing in the future based on that experience? And a lot of it does have to do with relationship building and the social response that you get in the aftermath of trauma and stress. And some of it also has to do with creating some structure. So when there's like predictable or semi-predictable trauma that you encounter as a group or as an individual in the field, what are some response plans? And that's one of the reasons that response plans are so valuable, is not only does it give you practical things to do, but it also just gives your brain something to do, so that it does provide some of that structure in the face of this chaos, which is very dysregulating, right? So in the medium to long term, it helps reduce the chances of PTSD as well. But there's so much more
it helps you to create the story. It also helps you to create the story in the aftermath of what we did to to take care of ourselves, to take care of each other, and to stay
Mhm.
safe, which is like a really powerful part of trauma first aid after an experience, is telling the Dan Siegel talks about the idea of telling the story from the beginning to the end, including all of the helpers and all of the things that we did along the way to take care of ourselves and to mitigate the trauma, and looking at who were the helpers.
Mm. That sounds like Mr. Rogers' thing too.
Yeah.
Look for the helpers.
Hmm.
Yeah. We only have like 10 minutes left, so I just want to be mindful of that, but I want to leave it in your very capable hands, Sarah.
Well, I'm going to read a poem before we leave, but I would like to offer to answer questions, which is a very like neocortex kind of thing, but it's also metaphors around nature and stuff like that. So, ooh, Danita, you got your camera going on. Does anyone have like questions or things they want to talk about more, or something that's that spoke to you that I talked about that we could elaborate on, or things that just reflections? Just love to hear from you guys. I've talked a lot, and sometimes I have a lot to share, and I'm not really I'm working on being just sharing it in a mentally organized way that makes sense to other people too. Oh, could you unmute?
There, is that it?
Yes.
Yeah. I was just thinking earlier about the, you were saying something really early on in your talk, Sarah, about experiences that the brain has right from birth. And from what I've learned about brain development, it was like those experiences start not at birth, but right at conception.
Mhm.
And so the brain, develops at a really, really high rate, right from time of conception. And each cell stores messages and experiences right away. So by the time a baby is born, they already have a whole lot of stuff in there. So yeah, I wasn't sure I heard everything you said exactly right, but
Yeah, and even before conception, right? We're already held in, we're already held as an egg. When you think about like the intergenerational nature of our development as well.
You're gonna have experiences like genetically from even your ancestors,
Mm-hmm.
because that's all brought chemically into you as you develop in your mother's womb or before her mother's womb. Like you were all there for generations, centuries, really. Part of you was there absorbing information. So yeah, everything about it is so unique because of all that. I find it really fascinating what you're talking about. I didn't realize what this was going to be about, but yeah, it's really great.
Yeah, we're a brainstem before we're anything else. We're like a little zygote, and we're a little brainstem.
Yeah.
With our little heart.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah, I really like what you two are talking about, Sarah, what you've been talking about, and just in general, what I've been learning through Mental Health Wilderness First Aid. I actually have a friend who is a physiotherapist, and she specializes in working with infants that are born with things like PTSD that they have from, and one of my children actually was from car accidents that I had while I was pregnant. And so she had this PTSD response, this like violent one, whenever we would go into a vehicle, the movements that she would associate with what anyway. And so then I know Day likes to recommend when the body says no, and just learning about how we store these mental, emotional experiences physically in our body, and then how she, as a physiotherapist, working with infants. And I just find it so interesting how it all ties in with what you're saying too, Sarah. So yeah. And
in my NMT group, it's like I was actually in a group for the last year with a bunch of people from the Comox Valley Child Development Association. They're actually becoming an NMT site. So the people who take NMT are, it's not necessarily therapists. Like I just joined an NN network, a Neurosequential network, and it's like coaches. They now have a NMT, which is the Neurosequential model of therapeutics. They have the Neurosequential model in education, Neurosequential model in sport, Neurosequential model in caregiving. So this research or this understanding of how the brain develops is being utilized in all of these different fields, which kind of which creates, like, I think and that's my interest over here, is creating more awareness of this way of understanding people and humans in order to create a real web of care, right? Because of the importance of the relational relational aspect. Oh, thank you, Day. Yeah. Yeah, so it's really, it's a really, like, it's a, and the thing is, Bruce Perry's got like tons of, if the training can be quite expensive and specific, but if you really want to learn about this way of thinking about things, there are lots of different opportunities to do that. And Bruce has created a lot of different books, and there's more and more people, and you can find out about people who in your community who might be, and I find that people who are interested in this are a very generous bunch of people who are doing all different kinds of work. I know Pathways to Healing in Comox Valley works a lot with families and works with infants, keeping infants with their mothers after birth who have experienced trauma and addiction, and they're doing incredible work keeping kids out of the system.
Is this part of the work that Gabe Mate does?
Gabor Mate?
Yeah, he's on a lot of his stuff keeps coming up on my news feed or whatever.
Hmm.
And but I've never really looked into it except a tiny bit. And I'm going like, I think he's educating people about this same topic.
Yeah. Yep. Gabor Mate is talking about trauma too, in a bit of not necessarily using the same model as Bruce Perry, but yes, he's another leader in that, in the way of thinking about working with people.
Yeah.
Sarah, I just had a question. And I do want to allow people to kind of, well, formally wrap at 7:30 because I want to respect people's time. So people don't feel bad or like they're missing something, but we are happy to hang out for another, 10 minutes or so if folks want to hang out and have more of a casual conversation. So I don't want to like cut us off right at 7:30, but I think it is good to kind of have a wrap if people do want to leave. I just wanted to ask, if going back to the idea of like the outdoor activities that we do, so paddling, being out in outdoor education environments, being out planting, being out as part of a climbing group, like whatever it is, and doing these activities that are, you talking about them being naturally regulating for the part of our brain that gets dysregulated with stress and trauma, and also encountering like predictable stress in voluntary ways. And I'm just wondering if your gut or maybe experience would be to bring that to conscious awareness within a group, potentially, of like, what are some ways that this kind of activity can be regulating while you're out here and while we're doing this work, and like what are some ways that being out in nature and doing relational, rhythmic, repetitive, rewarding things impacts the brain and that sort of thing. Like, I'm just thinking about it out loud, would you talk about that with the group? Do you think it's better on some level if it's in that subconscious realm? Or I don't know, have you thought about that?
Sometimes I like to let people know, like, because I'm interested in making this information accessible and in sharing as much as possible in some of the things that I know about. I think that it can be powerful sometimes in terms of psychoeducation, but in terms of its therapeutic value, I think just doing it, I think in terms of encouraging people to be intentional about it. Like I talk about it with people that I work with therapeutically. And I talk about it with the fact that, like, what you do in your day-to-day life is the therapy. And I'd like to help you break down the barriers to that. I'd like to help give you a warm experience. That's part of the, encourage you to go for a walk more frequently by going for a walk with you once a week. Encouraging you to drinking tea is a somatosensory experience. I drink tea with people too, right? It makes people breathe more deeply. It can be calm and regulating, helping people to notice what it is they're already doing. Like the clients that I have that love to run and listen to music, acknowledging that they're doing a rhythmic activity that is regulating. So I do think that the helping people to acknowledge that they're already doing it, because so frequently people come like to me and the work that I do, and they're like, oh, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that. And I'm really curious about, what are you doing?
Hmm.
How are you surviving?
Hmm.
And then helping people notice the things that are really serving them and their wellness, and the things that might have been survival functioning. And they're continuing to do survival functioning even after the traumatic thing that they started functioning in a way to survive. They no longer need those behaviors or those ways of functioning, like something that might have, the hoarding food. Hoarding
Mm.
food may have been a survival method for someone who couldn't get their needs met for food, right? And they might be continuing to hoard food, but they might not really need to hoard food anymore, because there's enough food and they can eat it at a time in a place that is they're in control of, right? So just like helping people notice those things, and then noticing the things that they're already doing that are actually really part of their wellness. And maybe they love to go for a walk and listen to their music, right? So helping people to notice and encourage them to move towards the things that are really healing for them, and let go of some of the things that might be keeping them in their survival brain.
Mhm. We were talking about in some of the prep for this little event, just I think you mentioned it earlier, just that people are often naturally drawn to things like going planting as maybe like, as a formal or informal rite of passage, but also sometimes like people find themselves out in the bush or find themselves out as part of these communities doing different kinds of things, in the aftermath of some trauma or in the aftermath of some grief, and maybe they're working through part of that out there. And maybe like you're saying, like that's a really healing space for them to be out in, and maybe this is part of the lens on why that could be.
Hmm. Yeah. And I was going to show you a film tonight called Push to Heal, but I just didn't feel like it was the best use of our time. But it's about skateboarding. It actually breaks down the neurosequential method model of therapeutics looking at it through skateboarding. And I can share that as well. And I think that that's a really interesting, because people have different ideas about what's happening in the skate park. Both of my kids skateboard. They love to skateboard, and two of my kids. And, I had another friend who said, I don't know if I want my kid hanging out with it at the skate park because of the kind of unsavory characters that might be there. But actually, it's a place where people are really accessing a lot of this. And there's a lot of really cool things that are happening relationally there, in terms of the way skaters encourage each other and support each other's growth and development, the rhythm of the wheels on the ground, um, and the way that it regulates you and pushes you to want to learn how to do more tricks, because your brain is kind of primed for learning new things because of the way that it regulates you. And so what I think about tree planting too, I think about like the rhythm, and I think about like the way that tree planting is, and the way you push yourself to plant more trees every day, right? Or learn how to do it better and more efficiently. Like when you talk to seasoned planters, they've got all these little hacks, all these little tricks, right? That help them to go faster. And they talk about that idea of when you get into a rhythm and you're not thinking about it anymore, right? Thinking too much doesn't help in most sports, right? If you're trying to think about it, that's not the right time to be in your cortical brain. However, you can grow and you develop these different ways of doing things, right? There's certain times that you want to be in different parts of your brain. So understanding how you get to the different parts of your brain can help you to be where you want to be. It's empowering. That's what I'm really interested in doing. I don't want to be someone that people have to come to for help. I want to be somebody who people come to and realize they don't need my help. They're doing it already, and empowering them to keep doing more of it in their everyday life, and then go on to see the next person and empower them to do more of it, and then to create systems that take the barriers to people being able to do what they need to do away from them, to make those healing activities more accessible. Yeah. So, I'm passionate about things like lunch programs and stuff like that.
And
Sarah
planting is healing.
Sarah, you were unmuted there a few minutes ago, and I just wanted to check in.
Yeah, well, I have a question that's not like totally formulated as a question yet, but I'll see if I can get there. So a lot of the women that I work with come in with children who are quite young. Not always, but that's just a trend I've seen, who likely have experienced some sort of or have been involved in some sort of violence or something awful. And I've thought a lot about the training, like the mental health wilderness first aid training of, like tapping, or what are some things that you see. And those sorts of grounding practices work really well when I have kids that are at an age where they're with that sort of cognitive ability. I had a client come in who had an 11-month-old and a 2.5-year-old. And I was like, well, what do I do with these two kids? Within reason, it's not my job to put a Band-Aid on and fix everything and, call it good and send them on their way. But with an older kid who's just experienced something, I want to be able to help and address them as well as addressing their parent. But what are things you would suggest that are, like repetitive, relational, all these things we've been talking about for those younger kids who, my first thought was like, I need to get one of those little, what is that, like tappy smashy game where you hammer the things in and you flip it over and you hammer them back in again? Day, you're nodding. I don't know what it's called. Maybe somebody knows.
I think tappy smashy thing is the actual.
I was just gonna say that something that just Google tappy smashy thing.
Yeah, or like a xylophone, but like I'm just trying to think of simple things like a bag of beans that I could keep in my office to work with very small children who maybe are not, well, anyone really, but I'm thinking mainly the smaller kids who, even
Which
if
is
I'm
great because you're thinking about relevant, right? What's
Yeah.
relevant to this age group? What does this age group enjoy? How do I can create a warm memory? And I think with like, when you talk about an 11-month-old, right? The kids love singing, right? When you think about like Rhythmic, they like singing. If you, when I've had a baby that's crying and it's difficult to soothe, my daughter was 12 a couple of years ago and she was learning how to babysit, and I used to go with her and I would just do neuroscience experiments on these poor children that we were babysitting together. So the baby would be crying and would be inconsolable. And I said, try clapping in a rhythmic pattern, right? And the baby stops and listens and is interested. Now start breathe. You want to make the baby start crying again, you start clapping in a really scattered, like rhythmic pattern. So sometimes with those kids, like humming, like I find if I'm holding a baby, I find I have a lot more tricks, right? Of different kinds of things that I do with them to soothe them. And I make sure that if I'm bouncing, and usually when you bounce a baby, you start to bounce probably what your mother's resting heart rate was, because it's kind of regulating to you. But as soon as people pick up a baby, and as soon as I start talking about picking up a baby, I'm holding a baby and I'm bouncing. Look, I'm just bouncing away, right? But I'm not bouncing like chaotically. I'm bouncing in a rhythmic way because that's soothing and regulating. Singing a song, a repetitive, like, just making up a little song. Or if you know that if there's a song, you can ask the kids. If you have a phone, you might not want to bring out the screen necessarily, but you might ask, is there a song you really like? And you play the song that they really like. You can have a snack together. You kind of follow their lead and see what are they interested in. What are the kinds of things that you could have in a room that would be helpful to kids? Maybe some little character. Kids love little characters. You could bring most play to life if you have characters. Right? Kids love little toys.
Little ones always love rhythmic music, movement like hammock or swing. That's why swings are good for babies.
I was just going to say a rocking chair or a rocking horse.
Yeah, that's really good for brain development. And the other thing is just crawling. Crawling is really, really important. We tend to put babies in a playpen, especially in the 60s. That was big deal. We put them in a playpen. They usually ended up standing up and crying in there. But the suggestion in a book is to have a very, very long area in your home, rather fenced off a very long area so they can crawl from one end to the other, rather than just being confined to the crawling, the sense of crawling is like really, really good for brain development, especially if there's rewards at either end, you know? So you can at either end and you just keep them moving. That's really good for brain development and also for mood.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's my normal reaction would be to pick up the kid, but that's not really in the scope of what I'm always meant to be doing. And the goal kind of is, I don't want to say distract, but find a way for the kid to be otherwise entertained and calm so that I can deal with the person that's just coming in crisis. So something like little toys or like Play-Doh even, but I wouldn't want a kid to choke on it. So anyways, these are some good places to start just for something.
Yeah. Staying regulated yourself,
Mm-hmm.
noticing mom, because that child is probably really tuned to mom,
Mm-hmm.
and noticing whether or not she's regulated. So helping mom to regulate is
Mhm.
one great way that you can help, and reminding, and sometimes just taking the baby so mom can have a break, so mom can regulate herself, because she's probably been really concerned about the wellness and the safety, and reassuring mom that, you know, it's going to be okay.
Mhm.
I mean, what I really love about this neuroscience approach is that it does shift our functioning, but the fact is our brain is plastic. And because it's a use dependent, and that's what I'm talking about these activities that we do, right? And the things that we do being really healing, is the fact that, like, having multiple different repetitions, you know, having somebody who's warm and accepting, I'd say don't sweat it too much,
Mhm.
because the more relaxed and calm that you are in that space, you know, the more everybody else is going to feel relational co-regulation is probably the most powerful thing that we have. So
Mhm.
creating that warm space, don't sweat it. These kids just want to have, like, really what I learned early in my therapeutic career with small people was creating warm memories is really powerful for
Mhm.
people, especially when they've had chaotic, unpredictable, stressed out caregiving.
Mhm.
So just being able to be that warm, calm person. So taking care of yourself, not the tyranny of self-care, not like, oh, what are you doing to take care of yourself? And making sure that your organization has good practices. And that's what I'm talking about, systems, right? Organizational care. Do they have a buddy for you? Are you allowed to be paid to go on a walk with somebody who you find regulating in your environment during your work hours to regulate yourself?
Mhm.
You know, do you have enough food, water breaks? You know, being organizations that have people who work in high trauma environments have a responsibility to provide good organizational care to the people who work for them, which is, again, following the 6 R's themselves, right? So the way that they provide organizational care to you should be relational, relevant, rhythmic, rewarding, and respectful.
Mm.
Thank you.
And
Sarah, I'm
now
so grateful for you being here. It's been a really cool evening.
thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're interested, Sarah, maybe it would be cool if you want to send me anything that you would recommend that I post when I'm going to make this into a little blog post with like a couple little clips and maybe a summary. And if you think there's any resources that should go on there, or any kind of takeaways or anything else you want me to note, that would be awesome as well.
Okay.
And I know there's so much more we could talk about, and I do want to respect people's time and everything, so I really appreciate folks attending and asking really thoughtful questions and connecting this to our work and practice in the field and in the city, and just with all of the I think that's what Sarah's saying is, you know, the relationship is so important, and sometimes we get caught up in trying to figure out, how do I solve this problem, or how do I fix this, or like what concretely do I do? And it really comes back to relationship. How do we build relationship with each other? And one of my favorite mentors, who Sarah has also known and worked with, I believe it's Jane Middleton Moss, and she always comes back to the idea of connection. Connection is the correction. And especially when we're working with trauma, it's just come back to connection, make a connection. So, last words, Sarah?
You are the best therapeutic tool and you can be, and ultimately you are your own healer, and walk towards your innate wisdom,
Hmm.
you know, and believe that the seed goes towards light when given the right conditions. So figure out your conditions, grow towards the light, spread out and share it with everybody else, and know that mental health is not a mystery that's left to a bunch of people in an ivory tower, that it is within all of our reach. And do your best to create, you know, well environments for people and advocate for those to be in the world.
Mm.
And one thing I'd like to figure out how I could share contact information too, if people would like to talk further. I am really passionate about like sharing and encouraging people towards what they want to do. So Terry, if you want to talk about school stuff, Sarah, if you want to talk about things in your environment, and Golden, I'm open to that too, to create for us all to be the change we wish to see in the world.
Yes, yeah.
And on that note, I'm going to read you a poem by Mary Oliver, because you know, something I didn't talk about was nature as a healing metaphor too. And I love her poetry and the nature imagery that is there. It really speaks to my cortex and my soul. So, and I'm going to read, even though it's kind of a blustery fall day, I'm going to read her poem, The Summer Day. The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper. I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who's moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who's gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll along through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? She's the bomb. And she gets the last word.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Clicko. And
Clicko. Thank you for coming.
yes, have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Chooch.
Chooch.